In order to do payroll in CenterPoint, it is essential to have an employer record for each entity that you wish to produce payroll reports for. Now, if you created your new database using the new database wizard by going to File and New on the File menu there, then when you were done with that process, you may have come up with a message like this when it was trying to open up the database. And this is essentially asking us if we want to run the payroll setup wizard. The payroll setup wizard is actually what creates your employer record. Now, obviously, if I hit yes here, it'll take me into the payroll setup wizard. But if you hit no and you're wondering, how do I get back to that payroll setup wizard? You can get back to the payroll setup wizard by going to Setup, Payroll Details, into Employers. And since you see that I have no employer record created yet, I would click New to create one. And the New option gives you two choices. If you say yes, then it will take you into that payroll setup wizard. So this is how I get back to it. And if I say no, it'll take me into creating a new employer manually. Creating a new employer using the payroll setup wizard is the easiest way to create a new employer. So I'm going to go ahead and click yes. This is a guide that'll take you step by step through setting up this payroll employer. So I'm going to click next, and the first thing it's going to ask me is information about this employer. Now, having an employer abbreviation is optional, but if you have multiple employers, it's recommended that you do go ahead and put in an abbreviation. That abbreviation needs to be 10 characters or less and unique to each employer. Then you're going to have a place for the employer name. Now, if you choose to not put in any of these other details, such as the address at this point, you will still want to go back and edit your employer record later to put the information in, because this is where it's going to pick up the information for any of your payroll tax reports. Then we're going to go ahead and select the city and state for that employer. And we're going to choose Red Wing, Minnesota here and put in the zip code. I could put in the telephone number now, or I can come back at a later time. I'll go ahead and put in the telephone number and click Next. Then it's going to ask you which of the federal taxes you need for this employer. I've selected all of those federal taxes, and then click Next. Now it's going to ask us some details about these federal taxes, such as what is our tax ID. So this is where you're going to put in your tax ID. Now, obviously, I've put in a fake tax ID. Then it's going to ask you for your liability account. So at this point, if you just ran the new database wizard, the liability accounts that are out there are the liability accounts that were also inserted into your database when you went through that process. So you might not yet have set up your specific accounts, so you might need to select it. Now, the new database wizard did insert an account called Federal Taxes Payable. I might need to go and change the name of it or adjust the account number, but I don't necessarily need to create a whole new account. Okay, so I could call it something else and change the account number. So I'm going to select it, and later on when I go into editing accounts, I might change some of the information about it. Okay, the next thing then is to select the liability account for your federal unemployment. Before we do that, though, I'm going to go back up to this one here. If you really needed to create a new account at this point, you could click New. A little bit later, you'll show you how to create a new payroll liability account from this database wizard. But for now, I'm going to select the one that was already there. For federal unemployment, I'm going to select the federal unemployment payable account, but since this has an employer portion to it, I also am going to choose an expense account. And I have several expense accounts out there, but if the expense account that I need is not there, then I could create a new one by clicking New. Okay, now mine are just going to go to this federal taxes payable. Again, I might need to change the account number or the name of it a little bit later, but I could select this one that the system inserted for now and then change it later. Okay, again, I'm going to choose that same federal taxes payable account for my Medicare. And I'm going to choose the federal tax, I didn't want a taxes payable account there. I wanted to choose my taxes, payroll taxes expense over here. And this was not a liability account. That should have been an expense account there. So I'm going to choose, for the Medicare, I'm going to choose the liability account first, and then I'm going to choose my expense account. Okay. And then for Social Security, I'm going to do the same thing, federal taxes payable, and then my expense account for it. And like I said, though, if you need to create any new accounts, just go ahead and click New. After you've selected which accounts you need, you click Next, and it's going to ask you who the vendors are that you need for each one of these liabilities. Now, the system inserted Internal Revenue Service here for both of those, and it is true that I pay it for both the federal taxes and for federal unemployment. It is recommended, however, that you have a different vendor for the two of these because they're paid at different frequencies. It'll help you out later down the road if you have a separate vendor for the federal unemployment. So I'm going to create a new vendor, and I might just call it Internal Revenue Service dash FUTA, FUTA for federal unemployment tax. Oops. Okay, that way it's just a different vendor. And so I can go ahead and select it. And now this one will be at a different vendor than that one, and it'll help keep those, the amounts due for each one of those separated. After that, I'm clicking Next, and it's going to ask me which state I need. So I'm only going to select one state, but if you select multiple states, just know that the next screen that you see, you will have duplicated for each state that you need. Okay, so I'm going to click Next, and Minnesota was the only state that I selected, but like I said, you might have one of these for each of the states that you select. So I'm going to go ahead and put in a tax ID there, and again, we want to select the liability account that we need for our state. And then if that state has any unemployment or whatever other taxes, you might see those down at the bottom. So anything that is just an employee tax will be at the top. Anything that has an employer portion of it will be listed down at the bottom. And different states will have different taxes. So again, I'm going to go ahead and put in a tax ID here for my unemployment. And we're going to select a liability account for the state unemployment. Again, this might not be the account number I need for my state unemployment liability, and I can change that later under the setup of accounts. But for now, to make it easier on myself, I'm going to select the one that's there. And then I'm going to select the expense account that's going to too. And mine are all going to an expense account called Payroll Taxes Expense. So we're going to select that expense account. But if we needed to create a new one, we could click New. Okay, so the New button is right down here on the lookup. I'm going to click Next, and again, it's going to ask us to verify which vendors those are paid to. And this is where you might want to go ahead and create a more specific vendor. For example, I pay my state taxes, my state withholdings, to the Minnesota Department of Revenue. So I'm going to click on the lookup, and I'm going to click New here, and I'm just going to create a new vendor called Minnesota Department of Revenue. Okay, and if I need to write a check out to that vendor, I could put in their details such as their address. If I'm paying them online, then it's no need to have those details in there. I can just click Save and select it. And then it is assigned that vendor to that payable account. And I would do the same thing for my unemployment payable. I would create a new vendor for that. For time's sake, I'm just going to leave it at the vendor that's out there. When I click next, if there was an unemployment portion for that state, you'll get one of these for each of the states that you selected that have unemployment. So it's going to ask me what the unemployment rate is. So I'm going to go ahead and put in my unemployment rate and then click next. And when the new database wizard was run, it actually inserted a number of earnings into your database. Some of them you may use, some of them you may not. You may make changes to the ones that we've already got set up, but it's just kind of giving you an idea of what types of earnings are out there, and you could select which ones you need, and you can make specific changes to those earnings after we've created this employer record. So I'm going to say that we have a bonus, we have hourly pay, we pay overtime, we also have salary employees, and we have sick time for both of those and vacation time. Okay, so we're going to select those earnings and click next. And then for each one of those, we want to select the expense account associated with that. Now, all of mine go to the same expense account, and I'm going to just use the one that's on the list here, even if I have to change the account number for it, that the default account number that came in, I can change that, but I'm going to just go ahead and choose that same account for each one. To choose it, I could either type in the account number or part of the name. I'm just typing in SAL and hitting tab, and it's going ahead and selecting that account. So that's what I'm going to do for each one of these. Now, you might have different expense accounts for each one of your earnings. We happen to be using just the same expense account. After you've selected the expense account for each one of those earnings, it's going to ask you what deductions and benefits you might need. Now, you might need more than what's on this list here, and we'll create those after we've run through this new date or this payroll setup wizard. But for now, let's select from this list which ones we need. Now, I'm only going to select one just for time's sake so that we can see what happens with each one of these that you select, but you would want to select each of the ones that you need. I'm going to click next. So for each one of them, if it was a deduction only, you would see it at the top. If it is both a deduction and a benefit portion to it, then you're going to see it down at the bottom here. So for my health insurance, we want to know what the liability account is for it. Well, I don't have a health insurance liability account yet, so I need to create one. So I'm going to click on the lookup, and I'm going to click new here. And we're going to create a health insurance liability. Now, I don't know what the account number should be yet, so at this point, I'm going to just tab past that. But if I do know what the account number is, I could type it in there. So I'm going to select health insurance payable. And the type of all of these liability accounts is a liability. And the category you should be putting those in is payroll liabilities. Now, when you choose this category called payroll liabilities, it's essential to go to the detail tab and then tell the system what vendor that liability is paid to. So I pay this to WellCare of Minnesota. So I'm going to click new here, and I'm going to create a new vendor. And I could put in a lot of details about this vendor, such as the address and any contact information. But if I pay the vendor online, then I don't necessarily need to have that information in the accounting system here. All I really need is the name. So I'm going to select that name. I'm going to save it and then click OK to select it. And that's going to be the vendor that liability is paid to. So we'll go ahead and select that health insurance payable account, and then I'm going to need an expense account for the benefit portion, and I happen to have an expense account called benefits expense. But again, if you did not, or benefits expense, and if you didn't have that account, you could click new here to create a new account. Just say that it's the type of an expense or cost of goods, and then choose the appropriate category for it. There'll be a list of categories to choose from. Okay, but we're just going to choose the one that's out there called benefits expense. I'm going to click next, and it's going to ask me to verify who the vendor is that I pay that to again. After that, I'm pretty much done with the payroll setup wizard, so I can print out the next steps of what I should be doing. So by hitting the print button here. If I'm ready though to go ahead and complete the payroll setup wizard, I click finish, and you'll see that it created a payroll setup record here for me that I can then edit and make changes to. Now we have a separate video on how to edit the employer record for any changes that you might need. And it goes into a little more details about where you can add information or change information on the employer. So you'll want to view the video on editing the employer record.